So Arizona Senator Kyrsten Sinema is facing big political trouble as a result of her stabbing President Biden and the Democrats in the back. Let's talk about it in today's video. Hi, I'm Mike Greiner. I'm a lifelong Democratic activist who's concerned about the direction our country is taking. If you share my concerns, maybe you could like this video, subscribe to this channel, maybe even click that little bell that will notify you when I post something new. So you just saw a video that's gone viral of Kyrsten Sinema shaking hands with Republican senators after she helped sink any chance of us passing voting rights legislation through the Senate. That legislation, of course, has already passed the House. And a big piece of it, the We the People Act, was actually negotiated by Senator Joe Manchin with an eye to being able to somehow attract Republican support, something that I think was never going to happen anyway. Nevertheless, Kyrsten Sinema, who claims that she supports voting rights legislation, was all too happy to vote along with Republicans in making it impossible for that legislation to move forward. Now, it's important to note that the vote that she took wasn't even to eliminate the filibuster. It wasn't even to somehow put the filibuster on hold when we're discussing voting rights legislation in the Senate. All it was to require senators who wanted to filibuster voting rights legislation to actually speak on the floor of the Senate, rather than simply signing a piece of paper to say, I filibuster this legislation, and then suddenly it's on hold until you can get 60 votes to overcome that. You see, the theory behind the filibuster dates back to the image that we have of Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, standing on the floor of the Senate, speaking for hours in outrage, trying to stop progress on legislation that he doesn't support. That strategy was actually used repeatedly by Southern Democrats, back when Democrats were bad, to stop any kind of civil rights or anti-lynching legislation, and to protect the power of the slave-holding states back before the Civil War. It's only more recently that this new procedure has been put in effect where you can literally sign a piece of paper and say, I filibuster this piece of legislation, and that stops it. And you need 60 votes to overcome it. It's just because senators were sick of having to stand on the floor of the Senate and argue ad nauseum to stop something from going forward. But that's the point, isn't it? Maybe we should make it a little bit difficult to stop legislation from moving forward. It shouldn't be required that 60 senators vote to overcome just one senator saying, hey, I filibuster it. Republican senators, of course, were all too happy to eliminate the filibuster when they had the chance to pack the Supreme Court. But God forbid Democrats do it. That's according to Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin. Now, to be fair to Joe Manchin, he represents a state that voted for Trump by double digits. What's more is I think it became clear to him that with Kyrsten Sinema stating her opposition to any change in the filibuster, just hours, by the way, before Joe Biden was expected to go to the Senate to discuss strategy on this legislation with the Democratic caucus there, it became pointless for Joe Manchin to oppose it anymore. He had previously said that he might support changes to the filibuster to require things like a quote-unquote talking filibuster, which again would require senators to actually hold the floor rather than simply signing that piece of paper. But with Kyrsten Sinema stating for the record publicly in the Senate right before Joe Biden went to the Capitol to discuss the legislation, it made it pointless for him to do anything different. Now, lots of people have made the point that here we are all mad at Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin, but yet it's the Republicans who've been blocking the legislation. And they're right, by the way. Republicans suck. It's just that we expect something more from Democrats, especially Kyrsten Sinema. I mean, even though she has always positioned herself as a moderate, at least since her days as a Green Party activist back in the past, she has still positioned herself as something other than the Republicans with their cultural war. After all, she's a self-described bisexual who refused to actually hold her hand on the Bible when she took the oath of office. Not exactly the kind of person who's going to get support from the right-wing Christian evangelists, right? But for her to so joyously stab the Democrats and President Biden in the back, not to mention the country, frankly, for essentially enabling Republicans to move forward in their slow-motion coup against democracy, this on top of her efforts to stop any effort to roll back the Trump tax cuts and to increase taxes on the wealthy, as well as her thumbs down when she voted against increasing the minimum wage. She has shown herself not just to be opposed to Democratic priorities and really doing her best to undermine any possibility of the Democrats succeeding, but she has shown herself to enjoy doing it, owning the libs in her own way, forgetting the fact that the libs are her people, who she used to be and who supported her. Kyrsten Sinema's justification for her behavior is that the problem with the Senate is not the obstructionism of Republicans, it's that the Democrats don't listen to them enough. Just listening to them, according to Kyrsten Sinema, would make everything work better. And so that's obviously the problem. Again, she neglects to mention the fact that Joe Manchin was actually the person behind one of the major pieces of voting rights legislation, and he, like her, has prioritized bipartisanship, as shown by his leadership role in passing the bipartisan infrastructure bill and in killing the Build Back Better bill as well. So you might think that the people who had supported Kyrsten Sinema in the past are now outraged, and you'd be right. Sinema, unlike Joe Manchin, represents a state that actually was won by Biden and where Democrats are actually ascendant. So her behavior is nothing more than sticking a fork in the eye of the people who supported her, both financially and with hard work on the ground. And the result is, not surprisingly, a lot of outrage among Democratic activists in Arizona. As some former Sinema staffers have stated, they, quote, "People need to know that she sucks." And she does, they're right. In Divisible, Michigan, too, that made Sinema's race one of their highest priorities, and it was directly involved in going door to door in support of her. Well, a poll of its members found that 93% support a primary challenge against her. And Emily's List, the organization that supports electing women's candidates nationwide, and as a result directly contributed $1.7 million to her campaign, not to mention all the other resources from its donors and supporters that they directed toward her campaign, has specifically said that they will not support her in the next election and might even oppose her. And I love this quote from Bernie Sanders when he stated that he was going to support people who directly opposed in the primaries both Manchin and Sinema, when he said, quote, "These are people who I think have undermined the President of the United States." Now, what strikes me as odd about that, as we may recall, is Bernie Sanders is actually an independent. He isn't a Democrat. Kyrsten Sinema, on the other hand, is a Democrat. And yet, who's the one concerned about whether President Biden succeeds in his agenda or not? And indeed, an organization has arisen that is raising money for, get this, anybody who runs against Sinema in the primaries. That organization, simply on that premise, has raised almost $500,000 already. And finally, a recent poll of Democratic primary voters found that, get this, 8% of them support her. That might be the lowest number I've ever seen for a Democrat incumbent among Democrats. And you might say, well, she's just planning on turning coat and becoming a Republican. But if that's a plan, I've got news for her. As I pointed out earlier, Republicans don't like bisexual, anti-religious senators who wear colored wigs on the floor of the Senate. Setting aside the fact that she's a woman, which is a liability among Republicans to start with. She might also be thinking that she could run as an independent. But that's not going to succeed because of the fact that Arizona is a swing state. So it's not like Republicans are going to throw their support behind her in an effort to make sure the Democrat doesn't win. No, they're going to want their own Republican to win, as will the Democrats want their own person to win, which doesn't leave any room for Kyrsten Sinema to get any votes. All of this has prompted at least one commentator to predict that Kyrsten Sinema's political career is over, and there's no loss there, believe me. She may be raising a lot of money from the corporate sources, but no amount of money is going to be able to overcome the antagonism she has generated among pretty much everybody. And now we have what might be the final nail in her coffin. It appears that a primary challenger is emerging, and this is a challenger who she should be worried about. It appears that Congressman Ruben Gallego is getting ready to run, and he is a fearsome challenger in the primary. A good Democrat, a person with a Hispanic background in a state that is getting close to being majority Hispanic at this point. He's a graduate of Harvard who joined the Marines thereafter, and rather than taking a desk jockey job, actually went and fought combat duty in Iraq. In other words, he's exactly the kind of person who could win both the primary against her and potentially a general election in Arizona. Good news for Democrats really across the country who want to see Sinema gone as quickly as possible. So at this point, it appears it's just a matter of waiting. Unfortunately, Sinema's got 3 more years in the Senate, and during that time, I have no doubt she'll do a lot of damage. But at least we can all be confident in the fact that once this term's over, we won't ever hear from her again. Well, if you want to hear more about Sinema and her political problems, check out this video here, where I talked a long time ago about how a primary challenge was necessary for her. I'll see you in that video, and in the meantime, let's hope for continued progress. Thank you.